Let's do it.
Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thanks so much for joining us for our first coffee and conversations of the year. And Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us. My
Hi.
name's Jess. I am the community manager here at Pear Tree, and I am so excited to have Kathryn join us to talk about a super important but often kind of overlooked topic in adoption, which is the naming process. Kathryn is a licensed master social worker and also the director of Absolute Love Adoptions, an incredible agency in Pennsylvania, where she is a home study provider, but also a fierce advocate for expectant and birth parents. And we're just so excited to have you join us this morning. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work with Absolute Love?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for being here. So Jess and I kind of connected over this topic because over the last couple years, have really developed an affinity for taking care of birth moms and expectant parents. I was a doula for a handful of years. I have two biological children of mine, and I had doulas at my deliveries. So I'm kind of a birth junkie. So there was a lot of parallels between that interest and field and working with expectant parents. So really, kind of getting into this field and seeing how we have this really intense process with birth parents as they're planning. Expectant parents are trying to figure out what's best for them. They're the center of attention. They make this plan, and then they kind of fade into the background. And it's really hard to watch when I'm doing placements and I'm seeing both ends of that, because I then continue to work with birth parents for months after. Some birth parents I've worked with for years, we still go to lunch together and check in. So seeing how the way that relationship unfolds really affects their grief process, their ability to build life after placement. It became something for me that I was really passionate about. So as Jess mentioned, I do a lot of home studies. And so working with birth parents and then doing these home studies, I felt like we kept having these same conversations over and over again, which was basically coming down to there's this power dynamic between both parties that is so obvious, but not really talked about. I think I've been in this field, 12, 13 years now in different capacities. And I, as a social worker, have regular training I have to maintain. We need 40 hours for inspection and then 30 hours a year for my license. So I'm always looking for new opportunities to learn things. And I just couldn't find anything out there that would teach me about this stuff. So I figured if I'm looking for it and I can't find it, this isn't going to be getting into the hands of people who need it because they don't even know to look for it. So part of this whole process for me has been really researching those power dynamics, what power looks like, how we exchange power in relationships, and then specifically what that looks like between birth and adoptive families. So last year, I finally, after 2 years of work, put together a course called A Tale of Two Mothers. And it's all about those power dynamics. It teaches what power is, how you get it, how you use it, and then specifically what that looks like for the duration of like a match placement, post placement, and then really why it's important to know about it and what you can do to nurture equilibrium as opposed to contributing to that power struggle that's kind of inherent. So I had been working on that work. Jess and I had connected. She and I did a podcast together and talked a little bit about these things. And what I'm finding is just inside of my course, there's content on naming and birth certificates. And that seems to be the piece that people are really like, wow, okay, we need more about this. We want to talk more about this. So that's why Jess and I kind of connected on this and thought that this would be something that perhaps y'all wanted to hear about. So here we are.
Yes. So when it comes to the birth certificate and naming process, as it relates to the power imbalance, what does that look like? Like, how is there an imbalance in power in the naming or birth certificate process?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that the birth certificate process is different depending on what state you're in. But generally speaking, there's a lot of dysfunction in how we go about doing this for adopted people, and it impacts birth parents and adoptive parents and the adopted person. So I'm in Pennsylvania. In my state, the process is something like this: the baby's born. the birth parent at the hospital files paperwork, and there's two different pieces to it. There's this registration of birth. So it's basically saying this human was born. And in theory, that information then goes on your birth certificate, which then is something you retain for life, saying, here's my entrance into the world. This is proof I exist. What happens sometimes for parents filing this paperwork in hospital systems is sometimes the second piece, which then goes to issue that original birth certificate, doesn't get filed because someone knows that this child's being placed for adoption. So it kind of gets, goes in a file, but it doesn't get filed where they're then issuing this birth certificate. Other times that birth certificate is issued, it goes to the birth parent, and then the adoption process moves forward. So the person at the center of this, the adopted person, has this original birth certificate that says their birth parents' names, where they were born, who gave birth to them, all that good stuff that says, here, this person is real. Adoption is then, placement, but then there's a period of months. In my state, it's usually 6 months before all that paperwork goes to court and is then filed. And then at that finalization hearing, which marks the end of the process, the original birth certificate goes like inside the court system and gets buried, basically. And then the adopting family gets issued a decree that they've adopted, and they file for an amended birth certificate. That amended birth certificate then says this child's name is whatever they've named this child, that they are the people who gave birth to this child. And that becomes the document that this person carries forward. So I hope that in saying that, you're all seeing that connection of how, for that person at the center of it, they were a whole person. And then in the court systems, we've redefined who they are without their permission and unnecessarily. Birth certificates shouldn't be saying this is who's parenting me. It's saying this is who I am. So there's a lot of feedback in the adoptive community saying for adoptees, that's just completely unnecessary. And it's really offensive that we do it. So the other piece of that is that for birth parents, their certificate for their child saying, I made this person, I birthed this person, I was there, and I gave this child life, it's gone. It's absolutely gone. So for them, you're a ghost. It's like you never existed. And how offensive is that to be the person that gave life to a human, and it's like it never happened? So then you have the adoptive family who's walking around with this certificate saying, here's my relationship to this person, but that's not actually true. So this whole process was kind of defined years and years and years ago, where adoption was just totally covered in secrecy. And the idea was that then the adoptive family didn't have to tell people that they adopted. And they could do what people were saying at the time was, don't tell your child they were adopted. Nobody has to know. So all these policies around birth certificates were done way back when for that purpose. And that's not working anymore. That's not necessary anymore, but we still do it. So when you're walking into this relationship and you as the adopting parent are like, oh, I'm open, I love birth mom, we value her, we want relationship with her. But then there's this document between you that's saying, but she doesn't exist anymore. Its very nature is really causing this disequilibrium of power. So then you have this person, this birth parent, who's trying to come and say, like, I exist, I'm real, make space for me. And the legal paperwork is like, but you don't actually exist. So there's all these complexities to why this birth certificate process is a problem, and how I'm hoping, again, as I'm saying this, you're all seeing like, okay, I can see why that process is a problem. So I can see a few of your faces. I hope the way I'm explaining it, you're like, yeah, I got this. So give me some feedback if I'm seeing like some, yeah, it makes sense. Okay. Are these things that are taught? I don't know if you guys are professionals or adopting parents or what your relationship is to adoption, but is this something that you guys are seeing that you've heard talked about before? That this is something in your spaces that people are having conversations about? I see a few people saying this is something they've heard. Generally speaking, again, I worked in this space for way too long before I sort of picked up on, why is nobody talking about this? This isn't part of your training as an adoption professional. No one brings you to this space and says, make sure you pay attention to this. No one says, talk to adoptive parents about how to protect this birth certificate or why this might be a problem. And certainly no one's saying, once you know it's a problem, please use your voice to advocate to reform how we're doing these birth certificates. So Jess, that's kind of my spiel about why birth certificates are such a big deal. Um, if you have any follow-ups, I can go with that, or I can kind of tie that to the naming and how that's sort of another layer.
Yeah. Gosh, I feel like there's so much that we can unpack
I
just
know.
in the birth certificate process.
Yeah.
But one thing that I want to add is it's not always a guarantee that your kiddo's birth parents are going to actually get the copy of the original birth certificate that they might fill out in the hospital. I have worked with hospitals before where the birth mom fills out, signs, hands over the birth certificate. But the second that those nurses or the hospital staff knows that that kiddo is part of an adoption plan, they then send that original birth certificate to the professional that is kind of on file for that placement, and they don't send a copy of the original birth certificate to that birth parent. And so that's not always a guarantee. And so there's a lot of things that professionals and adoptive parents can do to make sure that they hang on to a copy of that original birth certificate. Um, when I worked and like was actively in working in placements, I think I would get like 5 copies of original birth certificates from Vital Records because we would keep one in the office. We had to file one, adoptive parents, and then I always sent one to birth parents just to make sure that they had one. And so if you are an adoptive parent, that's something that you can make sure that you're advocating for. Um, making sure that you keep copies and original copies, not just photocopies of that original birth certificate for your kiddo to have in the future.
I think if you're a professional too, and you're working with birth parents or you work with professionals who do, often professionals don't know this process because an
Mhm.
attorney handles it. So a professional isn't necessarily going to know how important it is to have birth mom fill out that paperwork. I've been in scenarios where birth mom doesn't know, she doesn't really know what to do. So she thinks she defers to the adoptive family to fill out that birth certificate, thinking, well, they're going to put whatever name they want on it. So empowering mom to see that that's her document, that's for her and her child to document that they existed together in this moment. And it's so important for adoptees to see that. So in my state, I'm not allowed to have a copy of that. So when we go to finalization, the attorney will call birth mom and be like, do you have that paperwork? I need it. So there have been times where birth mom has that paperwork and then she mails it to the attorney and never sees it again. In our
Oh,
state, you have
wow.
to beg and plead to get even see that original birth certificate. And we're not the only state that's like that. So during finalization, if I'm like, hey, can I get a copy from, no, I'm not allowed to. If adoptive families like, hey, can I get a copy for my child? No, not allowed to. Your child has to be 18 before they can go to court and ask for it. And in some states, you have to prove why you even want it. And for some people, if it's just that you want it because it's your document, they say no. So if you see this document in the process and you're in a place where that's not going to surface again, get a picture of it. Encourage mom to hold on to it with all her might. That is something that's so important for adopted people and for birth parents. And in a lot of states, it turns to dust. You just can't get it easily. And I'm not telling you to do something shisty to get it, but if you see it and you're in a state that they're going to take it, take note of that and remind the people around you that that's an important thing. And that you want to really protect that and guard that.
Yeah. Chrissy?
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm an attorney in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, which are very different states. Massachusetts is an agency state, so I don't do newborn adoptions there. I only do confirmatory same-sex couple adoptions and step-parent. Um, New Hampshire's process is a bit different than what you've expressed so far, but you started to touch on what my question was, and I was looking for, from a clinical perspective, if you could talk more about the naming process for the birth mother, because what I often am encountering is sometimes they don't want to name the child, and that's okay, but more often than not, they're deferring to the adoptive family's selection, and that name's going on from the start. And then if they change their mind or are even considering changing their mind, they feel like they can't because now the child has a different name.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I am working with a birth parent early enough and can explain that process to them and get ahead of it, it's great. But I'm not finding that that always happens and that by the time I am brought in, it's too late. So I'm would love to hear thoughts more about that because
Yeah.
I do get multiple copies of the original, and I always make sure my birth parents have their own copies as well. As well as the adopted families, so they have it for their child. So yeah, I just like some more conversation around that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Chrissy, because that is something that really contributed to why I created the course too, because I actually was at a training once, and it was a professional putting on a training for families, prospective adoptive families. And somebody asked the question, what do you do about naming? What do you do if mom wants to name the baby? That could be really awkward. And the response was, don't talk about it. Wait till she brings it up, avoid it, deflect if she asks you, because ultimately you put whatever you want on that birth certificate. It's up to you to name your child. You're the parent. And I kind of imploded. And then after the training, really just was disturbed that a very reputable professional was telling people that. I have since encountered families where I do all the work to say, here's some alternatives to the naming. And still they come back and say, well, it came up and the social worker that was with us said just to not talk about it. So this is not something that agencies, social workers, professionals are as process talking to clients about. It's awkward. It can cause problems, but ultimately, if it's a match where they're not agreeing on a name, it's not the right match. And that is enough sometimes to say, let's dissolve the match and find a family that is open to choosing the name you're choosing or working with you like that. So I think it's twofold. I think it's the agencies need to be preparing expectant parents to have these conversations, and they need to be preparing adoptive families to have these conversations as well. My take on it is that this is expectant mom's child until she signs paperwork. So any decisions about who this person is are hers to make. Oftentimes moms I'm working with don't know that and come to me very they defer. Everything is, well, I guess it depends what the family wants. And I have to do a lot of work to help them see that that's not it. It's actually a lot of what you want, and then finding a family that can meet you there. So there's a lot of really reframing their ideas, empowering them to see that this is their child. And if they want to name this child, that is their right to name this child, whether they are 100% committed to an adoption plan or 10%. It's the same conversation. What I sometimes find is that if it's a good relationship that we've had open conversations, I'll sometimes do these video calls where they first meet and they start talking. And if they feel like they have a good relationship, I'll then host a conversation where we talk specifically about, what do you want the hospital plan to look like? What do you want naming to look like? Do you have names that you're considering? What would it feel like if adoptive family changed the name? I have these conversations, and more often than not, you can get to a place where people are agreeable. They can find something that they're both happy about. Ultimately, what adoptees are saying, the worst thing is to be named by a birth parent. Your adoptive parent totally changes it, and then you're left with feeling like you're two people and that you can't decide which name you are. And it's really it causes this feeling of like split identity and split allegiance. So why we would want to go into this process and set our children up to have to do that, I don't know. Most people, when they understand that, are like, okay, yeah, let's have these conversations. So my suggestion is you help expectant mom understand that that is her right to name this child, that she can choose to name the child something and share it with the family. She can choose to, I've had moms where they've named the child something, but that feels like something for just them and the child. And maybe it's something they call the baby through pregnancy, but they don't want the family to know that name. They want that to be like their like affectionate name for their child. I've had that scenario. I've had scenarios where we've really had these conversations at the hospital and decided what name do they want this child to have, so that there isn't this big amended birth certificate issue, that they are the same person. But I encourage you to have those conversations ask the social workers if they've had those conversations. Again, most of them don't know that they should be having these conversations, or they don't know how to have these conversations. And again, there are situations where, I'm thinking of a few where if expectant mom is like, I want my child to be named this, whether I place or not, this is this child's name. This is their right to be named by me. And I need a family who's going to embrace that. And the family that they had in the lead for the one that they were looking at was not the family then, because they were not a family that could see how important it was to have this child retain their name. So she chose a different family, and that's okay. But I, as the social worker, had to do the work to help her find that family. Also, if you think about it, that makes more work for social workers, and it makes more work for professionals to have to do that. But the overall satisfaction at the end of that process for everyone involved is so much higher. There's less conflict. There's less of that sense of like, who am I really, if you're working through these things together. So Chrissy, I hope I answered your question. And I don't know if that sparked any other thoughts for you, or places I could drill down a little bit more for you. You're mute. There.
I have an external mic that says I'm not unmuted, but it's not working. No, that was great. Thank you. I think that, I'm even encountering sometimes, I'm thinking of a case recently where the adoptive mother had adopted an older sibling and half sibling. And so they jointly, the older child, the mother and the birth mother all together named the new baby. It was really beautiful. They really worked together nicely on that. And yet the staff at the hospital screwed everything up, right? Mm-hmm. So we also have to be cognizant of that. And fortunately, I just happened to have the conversation with the right person at the right time, else I could have potentially had to do an amended birth certificate where it wasn't necessary. And so that sometimes well-meaning hospital registrars and nurses also can muck things up.
Yeah, and I think a lot of them don't know this process. They wouldn't know that this is the implications of them mucking it up. So really, as the professionals, we have to be as assertive as we can, because we know what this means. And again, for people doing paperwork, it's sometimes like, well, you'll just fix it later, but it's so much deeper than that in this space. So it's important that we know that. I think it's also important, this language I hear a lot is I think I've said it, that birth mom can name the child whatever she wants because the adoptive family can just change it later. And I think that is what you hear most often. And I think when you're hearing people saying that around you, having the ability to say, well, let's revisit that, because while that's true, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. And that's really, if you're in this space, that gray area of adoption is really where we exist. So again, I encourage you, if you hear that. There's also I wrote a blog 2 years ago or so when I first started really exploring this content. It's on my website, but I listed a few suggestions for how to have these conversations. One of them being, the adoptive family comes to the table and says, here's a list of 10 names that we really love. Is there one on there that you love as well? Choosing like if she comes with 2 names and you come with 2 names and they don't match at all, figuring out, is there one from each of you that can stay? Is that something you can agree on? I had that happen once where, again, birth mom came with 2 names and family came with 2 names. And what they decided on was the one name that birth family really wanted to hold on to was a family name. And come to find out, adoptive mom had a aunt who she was very, very close with the same name. So it worked out wonderfully for them, but they had to have those conversations in order to get there. So there is a blog, just put it in the chat. If you want to share that with people who maybe need to be having those conversations and don't know where to start.
One of a birth mom that's super near and dear to my heart, even still, 5 years later, we talk every couple of weeks, but she had made an adoption plan, did not have any contact with the adoptive family throughout her pregnancy. We talked about hospital plan, naming. She did not want to name the baby. She said whatever the adoptive family has in mind, like that's fine with her. She didn't want to know what it was. And then we're in the hospital, and I'm so proud of her for doing this. I was so happy when she did it. She decided she wanted to name her little girl. And so she named her And I was talking about it with the adoptive couple, and they ended up putting the middle name that she had given her daughter in with the name that they had picked out and originally planned. So they like split decision in the moment, like in the hospital after hearing this, they, realized how important that was to her and they loved it. And so they incorporated it in the name that they had planned originally, which I thought was just an incredible way to like honor this woman that they truly didn't know. They had talked to her on the phone, once or twice. The first time they met in person was actually in the hospital. Um, and so it's just a really like beautiful moment um, to honor, her in that relationship.
And I think for the child then to know the story about how they were named, because, you think about how many times you talk to your children about where they got their name and whether it was something that was in your family or a cultural name or tied to someone you really respected. That story, that name that you give your child, it comes loaded. There are things that you have in your mind about the person that's going to receive this name. So you figure the family coming to birth the child has those same thoughts most of the time, much of the time, not all the time. Obviously, there are women who maybe haven't considered that, but to know that you're bringing that to the table and that's honored. And then also knowing as the person who's raising this child and your hopes and dreams are kind of branded on your child with a name. That's important for both families and for the child then to be able to say, both of my families saw that. They saw that I came from two families and that they both were important and they worked together to give me a name. For the child at the center of that, that's huge. That's really, really huge. So really, we should be encouraging having these conversations throughout the process. I think this is also an argument for making sure that the expectant mom, has a social worker at the hospital with her, because often those are the spaces where these conversations happen. And that can be really hard to assert your opinion at all for both pieces if you don't have someone there that can kind of help guide those conversations when they get sticky. And they do.
They absolutely do. So for those of you that are here that don't know, I'm a birth mom myself. I've placed two daughters for adoption, and my second placement was a very traumatic birth story. And when I was in the hospital, I checked myself out of the hospital 12 hours after I gave birth because I was just in shock from this traumatic experience that I had just had. So the second the adoptive family got to Michigan from Louisiana, like I left the hospital. I ended up having to come back to fill out the birth certificate because they hadn't had it ready yet. Um, and I don't genuinely have regrets about, my adoption process or my adoption plans, but I will say that I regret this. I put her full name, including the adoptive parent's last name, on her original birth certificate. So on her original birth certificate, I'm listed as her parent, but she has her new last name. So she doesn't even have my last name on her birth certificate, her original birth certificate. And that's something that I still think about and still, regret to this day, making that decision.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that experience. I think that's something I've heard a lot though, that there's just, also you're postpartum, right? You've just given birth. It's not like you're thinking clearly, there's a
Right.
lot going on. So having someone advocate that, wait a minute, this is your process, this is your moment, let's mark that in time. It's huge. And I think with naming, we're also saying that this person belongs to our tribe. We that's how we define who we belong to and who we belong with. And so when the name is not reflective of who you are, it has really big implications. And I think for people who were kept and were parented by their biological parents and who had all those rights to name and were branded with their family's last name, it's sometimes hard to see why this might be impactful or why it is so important for people. But I think that's when we really need to lean into the adopted community and listen to what they're saying, and birth parents and hearing what they're saying. And this is what they're saying, is that this matters a ton. So in this space, we really need to advocate that people are getting the names that they are entitled to at birth, and that birth families are getting to name their child as they're entitled to. And that we're supporting those conversations with what that means then for placement and the name that they get indefinitely. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or things about naming that they might want Jess or I to talk about, or that you want to share? Everybody's quiet.
The coffee hasn't kicked in yet.
I like the idea that you shared about, bringing two names and, discussing that with the birth mom and having that conversation and being open to what she has to say too. This has been a really great conversation. So thank you for your input.
Of course. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I think a lot of with the naming, people sometimes think, okay, yeah, I'm open to it, but what do I do? Like, how do you actually have these conversations with two people? Where do you start? And obviously there's feelings like, for a lot of people, especially who are adopting, you've dreamed of this child for years, and you've often gone through a lot to get to this place where you get to parent. So there's sometimes this feeling of like, but my child has always had this name, and this is the child that I deserve and that I want. And that's all very valid. It's also important that we reframe that to parenting a biological child who does not have connections to another family is different than raising an adopted child. And there's nuance to it. And part of that is finding a name for that child that is reflective of that and isn't just, I'm the parent who's parenting, so I get to make all the decisions. But yeah, I think having that idea of, okay, well, why don't you bring a few names that are important to you and maybe help us understand why they're so important? What's the meaning? Usually that changes the whole tone of the parties that are involved.
Can I just say to Jess, thank you for sharing that very personal story. I know that was probably not easy to share, and it like makes me a little teary just hearing it. But so thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm just curious, and you do not have to answer any personal question, but I wonder if does your child know that you struggled with that? Like, I don't know if you have an open relationship or if you have any contact to share that with your child as they grow older, to understand, like, this is the decision that I made in the moment because I thought I was doing the right thing. But I do, have some thoughts or feelings about it. I'm just curious.
And I'm an open book. I pour my heart out and tell my story all the time. And she is only 5, about to be 6. So we haven't gotten to a lot of those complex conversations yet. But I will give a ton of credit to her parents because they have welcomed their home to me, and opened up their home and their families. I've spent holidays with them. I'm actually going to Louisiana next week to visit her. And they never shy away from those conversations. She FaceTimed me a couple weeks ago, completely out of the blue. I answered the phone and she goes, "Miss Jess," that's what she calls me, Miss Jess. She goes, "Miss Jess, you're my birth mom, right?" I said, "Yeah." She goes, "I grew in your tummy, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "But mommy's my mom." "Yep, that's absolutely right." And she goes, "Okay, I love you, bye," and hung up the phone. And that was literally the entire conversation. And will we have that conversation one day? I'm sure. There's a lot about her birth story that we'll have to talk about. I went into labor. I was supposed to deliver in Louisiana, went to labor in Michigan. I delivered her myself in a hotel bathroom floor, or on a hotel bathroom floor. And so there's a lot to her story that we'll talk about and unpack when that time is right. But you know, we have the copies of her original birth certificate, her hospital record. Like I have her baby bracelet and a couple of other things from the hospital. Her adoptive parents have a couple of things from the hospital. Like we kind of divided everything from the hospital and our time there. And so we'll have those conversations one day. And I won't not tell her the truth, and I won't not tell her, you know, I wish I would have done this differently.
Mm.
Thanks for asking.
That's why I love open adoption because, and I'm so grateful that you have that relationship with the adopted parents because, oh my goodness, for you to be able to have the opportunity to share those things at some point, I would imagine helps you to be able to process everything. So thank you. I am, Kathryn, I'm also a fierce defender of birth parents. I've worked with birth parents for 5 years. Now I mostly work with adoptive parents, but I fiercely defend birth parent rights as well. I think that's super, super important. And it does really help them to understand. It does help them understand when you try to put them in the shoes of a birth parent to understand why these things are important. So I'm very curious. I would love to see that a tale of two mothers training. That sounds very, very cool. So anyways, that's it.
Thank you, Anne. Just dropped a link in the chat there for the course. If you work at agencies and that's something that you want your team to take, I definitely encourage it because I think there's a lot of, if you are doing this and you're doing it well, but the people around you are not also reinforcing these ideas, it's those situations what I mentioned, like I'm telling a family, you got to talk about these things. And then they're going to placement and being told, no, don't talk about these things. So I think making sure the people that you interact with also have that information is just super essential to really changing the way that people show up to this process. I do also think that I think sometimes adoptive parents get a bad rap for being like overly aggressive in these spaces and selfish. And I think that's some of the conversation that sure, that happens. There are definitely motives that are selfish, but by and large, adoptive parents are really wanting to do this well. And they want to be the best person, the best parent, the best friend to a birth parent. They want all of that. But they come to the space with, you know, I do a lot of home studies and they come to the space and don't know things. They know what they've heard. They know other stories. They know what they've seen on TV. And a lot of that is just not accurate. And a lot of it is based on fear. The idea that, well, if this person's that involved in the relationship, let's say that she's naming the child, then what does that mean for me? So there's a lot of these ideas that when we take time to say, let's just break that down. Why do you think that? Where did that come from? What did your family life look like? What kind of boundaries did you have around your family? How were you encouraged to embrace somebody that's not part of your family? These are all concepts that affect how a person shows up to the relationship. And when you can help them look at that and understand that, things like what's a mother? What's a father? Why do you think that? Usually it's pretty narrow. What does a good mom do? What does a good dad do? When you can break some of that down, there's all this space to then reframe it. And I love when I'm at the end of a home study and a family will be like, wow, I just had no idea. I didn't know. And now I know. And they move into this space and I, you know, then see them take placement and the way that they show up. I'll tell you since I started teaching this tail content to my clients specifically, the vast majority of clients have come back for post placement and said, okay, I'm ready for a post placement. And when they tell me the name of their child, it's the name that birth mom gave them. And the statistics for how often that's happening now that I'm teaching this content, it's staggering. It was rare to see that before. So it really, really, really does matter. Anybody else have thoughts, questions, things you want us to dig into a bit more?
One of my dear friends, Ashley, she always says, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you're coming into this process, and it's like you said, Kathryn, parenting an adoptee and being an adoptive parent is vastly different than being a biological parent. and or parenting biological kiddos. And so when you come to this space, you have this idea in your mind of what parenthood is going to look like and what the adoption process is going to look like. But when you open your eyes and your heart and your mind to, welcoming birth parents and making sure that you're keeping those ties to birth family and their identity and biological connections, you're just you're just laying the foundation for such a healthy adoptee, a healthy relationship with their birth family, a healthy open adoption, and just doing such great work as adoptive parents.
Yeah, and that is, again, people want to do this well. They really do. It's just there's not a lot of resource, especially around the conversations we're having about the birth certificate and the naming. There's just not a lot. So if someone wanted to do this well, there's very little to teach them what that looks like.
And it's not something that's talked about often, from professionals to education for adoptive families. It's not something that's talked about. So people don't understand, that there's a whole other birth certificate that's created, changed, and then that original is filed away, never to be seen again. And in a lot of states, adoptees don't even have access to that when they are 18 or 19 or 21 or, whatever a state's law may be. Like sometimes those original birth certificates, the very first piece of information about a person, are filed away and under lock and key and never seen again.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think if you are somebody who was raised by your biological family, that might not seem like a big deal because you've always had access to that. That's just what it is. But the understanding that that's not what it is for adopted people, when you can feel that and feel how that might be something very impactful, I think it changes the way that you approach this process. I think part of this is knowing. When you know that this is happening, you can then look for steps in the process where you can be a little bit more assertive about getting that, or you can ask questions. And I always say, most people don't know. So if you're asking a question, even if you do know and feigning ignorance, like, what do we do with this paperwork? Ask them at the hospital, where does this paperwork go? Now, what's the process for this? Reiterating, okay, now she's going to get a copy of this, right? Reminding birth mom, like, you're going to get a copy of this, right? Like asking these questions for clarification also helps bring up this idea of, oh, I guess this is something we need to think about. I guess this is something we need to do. Otherwise, half these things don't get talked about. I've been at the hospital for many, many placements, and a lot of this stuff happens behind closed doors. There is not a person coming in front of all parties involved and saying, okay, now we're taking this paperwork and it goes here and then this happens. The other part of this is that this is all happening in a space where mom's just given birth. She might have been up for 24 hours. She's probably not thinking clearly. She might have been on pain medications. The emotion and intensity of this whole process, this whole experience of pregnancy and placement is all culminating. And then you have this family who's all hyped up because holy cow, they're getting a baby, and they probably traveled for hours and hours to get there. And this is like years of dreams coming true. So they've got this tunnel vision, and it's awkward because they don't really know where they fit and what are they supposed to say and what are they supposed to do. And oh my gosh, it's a baby. I mean, all of this is going on. And then you have a professional being like, and here's a packet of paperwork. I mean, it's just the details get missed because there's too much going on. So knowing that this is something that will happen at the hospital gives you that knowledge of, okay, put it on my checklist, right? I have to ask about car seat safety. I have to ask about formula, and I have to ask about birth certificate paperwork. And that just helps people prepare differently and have conversations that are hard.
Yeah. And thank you, Liz, for reminding me. There is a bill that was introduced federally to help standardize the hospital process and how healthcare staff are trained to handle the hospital experience for adoptive placements. It is the Hospital Adoption Education Act. And if any of you want to read more about it, get involved, call your congressman or congressperson to let them know that you support this. You can find all of that on the NCFA website. I will drop that in the chat, but there is so much going on federally to make some incredible, impactful change in adoption. And I think that's going to be a huge piece of the puzzle in making sure that adoption can remain a healthy and safe option for birth families and adoptive families.
I think in you saying that, this is what came to my mind, that I think it needs to be said that there is no training program for adoption professionals. There is no standard education or license or anything for, quote, adoption professionals. So you could be something as unregulated as a facilitator saying you're a professional, or an agency director with a master's in something, social work, psychology, something like that, or anything in between. So when you're expecting that your professional is going to know certain things, there is no expectation of that. The same goes for nursing staff, hospital staff. There is no training program for adoption. And in fact, most nurses will tell you they maybe saw 5 minutes of it in their training program. Myself, as a licensed master's level social worker, I went to school for my master's knowing that I wanted to work in private adoption. My training in private adoption was like, again, a class of a larger course, maybe. So the fact that I have this degree does not even say anything about my adoption competency. So this field is wildly unregulated, and there is no true adoption professional. So I think that's important to know. I think that sort of drives home that point that all the stuff we talked about today, it's definitely not being taught structured in any type of way for any professional involved in this space. And I would ask the attorney, I know there's at least 2 attorneys in this group, if this is something that resonates for your profession too, if there were specific adoption courses you took. I'd love to know more about that. If either of you are welcome.
In law school? Huh. No.
Yeah.
It might have been a portion of a day in family law if you took family law, because that's not even required. And I hated my family law course, completely hated it. So yeah, no, it definitely does. And I think we have professional organizations, right, that have continuing education and more specialized areas and really are able to drill down, but no, it's very similar. So just like you have to do a certain amount of education in each year, so do we. And that's where you get the specialized, but you don't get it coming out the door of school. Absolutely not.
Mm-mm. No, and I think my understanding too with like pediatricians, they say the same thing, that it's all really sort of self-found information. You have to really be looking to learn this stuff, which is really, really unfortunate, because for all of those of us working in this space, we want to be as good at this as we can. And there's no way to, it's on your own, right? You gotta learn this. I think there's also a lot of learning from people around you, which can be good. If you're learning good things, or it can be not so good if you're learning bad habits or bad things or really dated concepts of how to do this. I, as an adoption professional, I learned from the person in front of me, and lots of great, but also some not so great. So really being mindful of that. People know the questions to ask when calling a professional. Yes, Becca, I'm just seeing your comment that, when we're training families for this and asking them to, be good humans in this process, and then we're sending them out into the Wild West and saying, make good decisions. They're like, I don't even know what that means. What am I even asking? And I can tell when I get referrals for home studies, I can tell when people have been primed, ask these specific questions to your provider, but then they don't know the answers, right? They don't know what I should be saying when they're asking this information. So I can see where it would be very easy for someone to hire a professional they think is going to be advocating for them through these really difficult processes, and finding that they were not, in fact, competent in adoption in many ways. So yeah, it's Wild West is how I always say this is working in this space.
It 1,000% is.
It's hard. So if any of you are professionals here in this space, I commend you. It is tiring work. Many tired days. Do any of you have any stories that you want to share about clients or experiences yourself with naming or birth certificates that are maybe different than something we've shared, or something that you thought was handled really well around you? I'd love to hear some experiences of what this looks like for you all.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. It's been such an interesting discussion. Sorry I was a bit late. I just wanted to say I learned a lot from everyone that's involved in adoption and my clients so much. Every case is different. And something that I've gotten into the habit of doing. I don't know where it came from, if it was a social worker that first brought up at a hospital, but I always ask for doubles of everything. I ask them to make 2 sets of footprints, make extra wristbands if they can, extra cradle cards, even if, often I'm representing the expectant mother, even if they don't know if they want it at that time, I just say there's extra copies if the kid wants it later. And so it won't fix everything, but just, I find that you kind of have to guide the hospitals. Like they want to help, but they don't really know what to do and they tend to be defensive. But if you kind of ease it in, in ways that seem positive, and that's just something that, small thing, but I think could make a big difference to someone.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for doing that and for sharing that.
I have, when I was working for a paralegal, or I was working as a paralegal for an adoption attorney in Louisiana, I would get the copies of original birth certificates. And there were some birth moms that I lost contact with. They never responded to me. And I had these copies of original birth certificates, and I don't work for him anymore. I've moved 1,200 miles away to Michigan. I still have a filing box in my closet with copies of original birth certificates and stuff from the hospital for one day, 5 years down the road, when, potentially this birth mom might reach back out, or she reaches out to the adoptive family and they don't have it. Like, I have carried that stuff with me, and I will hang on to it for as long as I am alive or until someone needs it. But, I think getting copies of everything and doing everything that we can to make sure that that identity is preserved and those connections are maintained is just so, so important.
I think too, remembering that when you ask an expectant mom once, do you want to name the baby? That's not enough. Her opinion might evolve as this process evolves. So reminding her as you continue going that there's still a chance to do this. And if this is important, there's still time to make a choice about it. I think that's essential. And then I think exactly what you mentioned, Jess, that the perspective about wanting that birth certificate for themselves as a birth mom and as an adopted person, that might change over time. So knowing it exists somewhere, so it's there when someone wants it, is huge, versus it just going to dust in the court system and not even being something that they can have. So I think in adoption, that just remembering that this is intense. This is a very intense experience, and it evolves over time, and we have to make space for people to evolve with it. Anybody else have anything they want to share? Any other thoughts about naming, birth certificates, ideas for functioning in this space that might help all of us?
I appreciate that comment about just the intensity of it. We work with people who experience infertility, and often I imagine a lot of your adoptive parents that you're working with have gone through infertility. And so layering that on top of the intensity of the adoption or underneath it, I think it's just good to be mindful of that. And in the whole environment, it's just another layer that I worked briefly in adoption many years ago, and that was not even on my radar, as part of the equation. So I just think I wanted to throw that out. Like it's just a piece of the puzzle that is very painful, and just a whole layer of trauma. And usually after years and years and years of working with that process. So that's all.
Yeah, Shelley, I think you made a great point. That
awesome discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, all of you. I think you made a great point that it's just not on the radar for most people. And again, why would it be, right? It's not around us, so you wouldn't know that it's something you need to know. So now you do. Now you do. I hope you share it with someone that also needs to know, because it is really, I think that this knowledge and this work in this space with birth certificates and naming would really go a long way to changing how this experience is for everybody involved in the process.
Absolutely. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you everyone who came on. I put all of Kathryn's info and the links that she mentioned in the chat. I really encourage you, especially if you're a professional or an adopting family, her Tale of Two Mothers course is just incredible. And she has such great resources and education and blog posts available on the Absolute Love Adoptions website. So thank you so much, Kathryn. And I would love to do this again.
So would I. Love talking about this stuff. Thank you all for listening and being here and being open to learning these ideas.
Thank you so much.